I'm also I'm also a member of the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska and descendant of the Cheyenne and Choctaw Nations. I want to thank you all for coming tonight to our Indigenous Peoples Day evening lecture. We are very delighted to have everyone here as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. We're grateful to OMA and to Kwame, the university, for supporting us and all of our endeavors, and for standing in solidarity, not only with the Indigenous community on campus, but also in supporting Indigenous people as a whole. We are also very, very honored to have Dr. Dennis Seymour as our returning speaker this year. And it is our greatest pleasure to have him here tonight as our lecturer. And we are all very happy to share this day with you.
Ready to start the video? Okay, so this is a video of this is our virtual powwow for 2020.
Hi everyone. My name's Jasmine, and I'm the current Vice President of Indigenous Students at Hopkins. So I'm just going to be reading a brief biography of Dr. Seymour. So, born Dennis Edwin Banks in Flint, Michigan, his father is full Eastern Band Cherokee from Madison County, North Carolina. His mother is German and English from Ohio, with a reported Iroquois ancestor several generations back. Dennis was adopted when he was 5, but has always identified his race and heritage as Native American. He has been an activist for Indigenous causes throughout his life. Dr. Seymour moved to Maryland in 1960 with his mother and graduated from high school in Howard County. He received an associate's degree from Cantonsville Community College, his proudest moment, 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of Maryland, a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, and a doctorate from Southwest University. He was employed as a Maryland state trooper for 16 years and owned a private investigative firm for 20 years after that. He has been a professor for the Community College of Baltimore County, a department chair, and recently retired as the dean of the CCBC School of Business, Education, Justice, and Law. He is a faculty advisor to the Indigenous Cultures Club and serves on the Native American Studies Program Advisory Board. Dr. Seymour has been a member of the Baltimore American Indian Center for over 25 years and chaired 5 Baltimore powwows that were held at CCBC Cantonsville. He recently served on the board of directors of the Baltimore American Indian Center that serves on the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs Advisory Board, the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs Education Committee, and is the chair of the Baltimore American Indian Center Heritage Museum.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I do have a great deal of pride in being an alum from Johns Hopkins. So this evening I've got a presentation. As you can see from the title, it's a little dark, but I think we need to deal with truths here. The whole slideshow is in black and gray, and that's intentional. The title of this is not about a history of Native Americans or how it's been taught or the treatment of Native Americans in this country, but as to the question as to whether the American government did commit genocide. The subtitle, "The Only Good Indian is a Dead Indian," is kind of where I started with this presentation a couple of decades ago, and it's a work in progress. Curious about the quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," and I will touch on that as we get a little further along in the program. So, Osio, in the Salaji language of my Cherokee ancestors, hello, Osio Nagata, hello to all. So why do we study history? Basically, Santayana's quote from 1905, "Those that can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And in what essentially is genocide? This is the Webster's definition of genocide: destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. And I actually prefer the United Nations definition. But before we go through that, when I say genocide to you, what comes to mind? And very typically, it's Darfur, more recently, Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, and clearly Nazi Germany. And it's reported that Hitler used the model that the United States had used on its native population to inspire him and give him direction as to how to exterminate the Jews in Europe. The General Assembly definition from 1948 is very specific about where genocide might have occurred across the entire world, and any acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or part a national, an ethnical, racial, or religious group, any killing members of the group, any causing of serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting life conditions calculated to bring about its destruction, imposing measures to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So as we go through here, any single one of those violations does in fact measure up to genocide. And so to kind of keep score as we go along, very often when I do this in person, I will give people a scorecard and you can check off any of those. So any single act is in fact genocide. So as we go through here, you be the judge. Last year when I was involved in the powwow at Hopkins, I was asked to reserve the date and to speak and to be involved in the dance and the procession. In doing so, I think it was the 11th of October or something, I marked it on my calendar and realizing the day before that it was Columbus Day. And it was intentionally Columbus Day that that this was held. And that's courageous. That was courageous for Hopkins. We're now in the third year. The Community College of Baltimore County, where I recently retired from, had its first annual Indigenous Peoples Day today. And actually Baltimore City had its Indigenous Peoples Day today. The bill's not been signed to officially recognize it yet, but it's a long ways forward. So we've been sputtering along for years, and all of a sudden it seems like we're jet propelled. We're making great strides in correcting history. So with that, here's a news flash. Christopher Columbus discovers America. You know, the fact of the matter is Christopher Columbus never set foot on the North American continent. He encountered the Arawak Indians in the Bahamas. And during that time, I will play you a piece of his log here that if you can take a minute to read part of that. So let me talk a minute about the North American Indians, those that were on the continent. In the 1490s, at the time of first contact, and that in itself is probably a myth. I think this is multiple contacts before then, but that's for other people to work out. The Library of Congress says that there were 900,000 Native Americans on the North American continent. Most of the anthropologists that I talked to say that's far short, that it probably was as many as 15 million occupying the North American continent. And obviously that included Canada down to Central America. And they would have been in clans, probably within walking distance of one another, all across the entire continent, with the exception, the Great Plains were wide open, the grasslands were wide open. So the hierarchy is nation, tribe, clan. And a clan would have been anywhere from 5 to potentially 100, 150 related natives in a group. So you can imagine that at the fringes of those clans, there were as many as 80 tribes on the North American continent. And those 80 tribes were basically as different as the people, as the countries in Europe. So let me say that again. So you really understand Native Americans in our appearances, our culture, our customs. We are as different from one another, from a tribe to tribe, as would be the Italians and the Swedes, and all of the different countries of Europe. We've all been kind of homogenized over the years, especially lately, but there are certain customs that are universal and some of them not so much. So at first contact, we may have had 15 million natives on the North American continent. So here's some examples of what I consider to be genocidal intent. You can check any of these off. You've answered the question that has in fact the United States government, under government auspices, committed genocide. So I'm going to start off with Columbus's log. And in his log, and it's some of it is redacted just for volume's sake, but he talks about how great things are. They're great parrots. The Indians brought cotton and spears to them. They traded everything they owned. Well built, good bodies, handsome features. Do not bear arms. They would make fine servants. And that's essentially the context in which Columbus and all of the other explorers at the time really looked at the Native American Indian. So we'll start 1765 with an incredible act near what is now Amherst, New York. Chief Pontiac was at Fort Pitt, and there was some trade going on. There was reasons for the natives to be near the fort. There was commerce, and they were living near the fort. But Amherst was upset about the fact that the Ottawa Indians had sided with the French in the French and Indian Wars, and has essentially were against the British. So in one of the very first acts of germ warfare, biological warfare, he sent to the Indians as a gift, those who were around the fort, he sent them blankets and handkerchiefs from the smallpox ward. And in doing so, obviously wiped out the entire group, who had no immunity from these kinds of diseases. So I want to jump then to about 1830 and early 1800s. The natives, especially living in the east and the southeast, the Cherokee occupied 5 million acres of land in the Smoky Mountains, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, Kentucky, even a little bit of Virginia. And gold was discovered in Georgia. Now you think of gold rushes in Alaska and California and so forth, but gold was discovered, and it was realized that the Indians are sitting on 5 million acres that potentially has gold deposits in it. So Senator Forsyth from Virginia started lobbying the president at the time, Andrew Jackson. He was called the Old Possum by the natives. And Jackson trying to figure out what to do with them. And he then talks about in this quote here that he can reconcile the mind to extinction of one generation to another, for another. And that's the basis of manifest destiny, that this becomes actually a religious situation. So manifest destiny is this expansion which prearranged by heaven. There's really nothing that they can do. This is a higher power that is directing us to do this. And that's the excuse for moving the Indians. So the Indians in the southeast, and it didn't really seem to apply much to the Iroquois nations and those woodland nations in the northeast. But the land that was wanted was that land that was essentially from Maryland and Pennsylvania on south, especially through Georgia. The Cherokee had a city in New Echota, Georgia, that was a model city. It had a town square, it had a judiciary, it had a place of religion, and they were living pretty well a life that where they'd assimilated. It's said that they sat afternoon tea at 2 o'clock or so with the British. So how do we get rid of them? And the issue is And the concept was that the Congress and the president was being lobbied for is to move the Indians, all of them, west of the Mississippi. Most of the land west of the Mississippi was hardly explored much. It was of little value. You can imagine if you've been through Kansas and the Great Plains, it is nothing there. I was just recently out there and they didn't even have trees to make fence posts. They made the fence posts out of granite. It was so desolate. So that whole area, they were going to move them all west of the Mississippi and let them live a good life, and we will be rid of them. So comes the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, during that period, they were lobbied very, very heavily. The natives that had the largest, the tribes that had the largest landmass was in fact the Cherokee. And Chief John Ross of the Cherokee spent more time in Washington than in fact he did with his tribe. He in fact was, you'd see him on all photographs of him with the top hat and tails, because when he came to town with his regalia, they told him right away that you can't possibly see the great father who was the president or the senators dressed like that. So comes the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And here's another quote by Jackson, and this one is especially important. It's talking about achieving civilization. I can't imagine a president today, well, maybe I could, but most of the times I couldn't imagine a president making a comment like this about an entire civilization. So this civilization that they're talking about, achieving proper culture and civilization. The next few slides that I have here, if you could take that word civilization out and put Christianity in there, you would really get the concept of what was going on. If the natives were not civilized or Christian, then they were less than a human being. And religion probably did more to decimate the Indians than war did, than starvation did, than disease did, because it gave the colonists and the government some satisfaction to know that these are less than human beings. And this is from the committee of the House of Representatives in 1830. Indians are incapable of civilization and Christianity. And the reality is that the Native Americans are probably more spiritual than any single group, whether, you know, any organized religion. The problem is they had deities. They believed that spirit was in, you know, the wind, the sun, the water, the land, inanimate objects, things that they would carve, things that they would produce for their own use had spirit in it. So the Bible says that you'll only worship one God. And the Indians, in fact, had very many, which was to their detriment. The generals, this was printed in the magazine North American Review. Very eloquent, but it really does state the case that they'll be made to vanish as the snow melts before the sunbeam. And that's in fact the migration of the colonists toward the west. And this is John Forsyth. He's really a big player here, and he probably doesn't get as much heat as he should for this. He's the one that wanted the gold opened up in the areas of the Smoky Mountains in the Carolinas, but they're a population that's useless and bothersome. So the Cherokee had assimilated to a point that they actually sued Georgia in the Supreme Court of the United States in this Worcester v. Georgia case, and actually prevailed. The Supreme Court said that that they did have designated sovereignty, and the land, in fact, was theirs. John Marshall was the Chief Justice at the time, decided in the favor of the Cherokee. So at that point, you would think all is well. They've made the case. They're not going to move. And here's what Jackson said. He said that he wasn't going to enforce the verdict, and that if the Chief Justice, John Marshall, wanted to enforce, he would have to do it himself. So totally ignored the success that they had in the courts. So it comes to a point at this point where there were many of the Cherokee, especially, had left, but all of the tribes were Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called by the government. A lot of them had seen basically the handwriting on the wall and had gone west on their own. But there were a great many that stayed, some intentionally, some hid, some were not bothered by the cavalry, and there were many of them that were, in fact, left in the area. So in enforcement of the Removal Act of 1830, the Georgia militia was brought about to move the Cherokee along with the cavalry. And it's a terrible time in history, as they would come upon Cherokees living some of them lived in frame homes, actually, like you would see today. Many of them in log homes. The eastern tribes rarely used teepee, but they would have long houses surrounded by wigwams, and those that didn't leave were rounded up. And during that roundup, it was a physical roundup. They would come to the house, they would roust everybody out of the house. They would herd them off with no concern for keeping family units together, children with parents, grandparents, elders with the family, and they were taken to areas where they had stockades, and the stockades were nothing in them. They were just walls, 200 by 200 square feet, with no facilities, no water, no shelter. And when the stockade would get full, they would then force march them from New Echota, Georgia, to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Thus the Trail of Tears that all of you, I'm sure, have heard of. And it wasn't just one march. It was actually 13 marches. And that became actually the split between the Cherokee Nation, which is based in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Those that are in fact left in this area, they actually were given federal recognition as a tribe in 1868. So you have the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Those were the ones that remained in the East. So the Trail of Tears in 13 waves. And it's interesting, Chief John Ross, who had actually never did agree to the removal, refused to sign the treaty and the removal. The government went to 4 of his underchiefs when they saw that John Ross was not going to sign any agreement to be removed from their homeland. He asked the underchiefs to sign the agreement. He paid them off. It's understood that they paid them off. So the 4 were, let me see if I can remember here, John Ridge, Major Ridge, Stan Watte, and Elias Boudinot were the 4 that signed the agreement to move. And then the agents for the government came back and said, look, we have a signed document here, so they need to be forced to move. And it's ironic that the 13th wave, the very last wave of about 1,000 Cherokee, was led by Chief John Ross, who assumed his rightful place as the main primary chief as they were relocated in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And as many of you know, the result, thousands of Indians died, 4,000 Cherokees died, but many Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw all died as well along the way. They didn't figure their march very much according to weather. Many of the Indians froze to death along the way. The elders couldn't keep up and died and were left along the way. And it's just an incredibly sad case for this government. And if we haven't reached, by the way, if we haven't reached genocide yet, you let me know. So the Indians now are west of the Mississippi primarily. And as the nation grew and settlers came in and land was being given away, the Indians were pressed to move westward all of the time. Even more, they were relocated from areas that they were originally located in. There were some mineral rights that they found in areas, so they took the reservations away from them. So there was constant uprisings in the West, not only with the Plains Indians that had occupied the area before the Removal Act, but also all of the Cherokee and Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creeks, and Seminoles that had been moved there. So there were uprisings that were called the Indian Wars. And it endured for about 20 years. And the period of, they were trying to get peace together in the 1860s. And in doing so, there was a lot of pushback, not only from governors of territories, but from a lot of the generals and the cavalry that had actually been fighting the natives for decades, and trying to punish them for Little Bighorn and some of the successes that the natives had had. If the Indians won, it was a massacre, and if the cavalry won, it was a great victory. So that was obviously the bias at the time. Here's some of the quotes that I run across over the years. This is the governor of the Colorado Territory. And he was in charge of the 3rd Regiment. And he's wanting to know, what can I do with them if they don't kill Indians? So that was their primary focus. And General Curtis, he wants more retribution. He wants no peace until he can make the Indians suffer more. General Connor, the Platte River runs east and west through Nebraska and in the Great Plains. Directions to hunt like wolves and kill every male Indian over 12 years of age. And brings us to the subtitle of my talk. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. There was a conference with in 1869 that included a Comanche chief, and the Comanche chief had a discussion at this conference with General Sheridan. And in that discussion, I'm assuming his English wasn't very good, but he reportedly said, "Me Talkaway was his name, me good Indian," meaning that I'm trying to go along with the program. I'm trying to figure out a solution that's good for both his people as well as the government. And Sheridan's exact quote, "The only good Indian I ever saw was a dead Indian." So he said, you can't possibly be a good Indian. The only good Indian I've ever seen was dead. And Sheridan was really a nasty player here. When he was not fighting the Indians, he would take his sharpshooters out and would systematically kill herds of buffalo to deprive the Indians of food, clothing, and shelter, and just leave them there to die and rot. So there was no value to the Indians and to make them suffer. So comes Colonel Milt Shivington, 1864. His comment is, "Damn any man who sympathizes with the Indians. He's come to kill Indians. believe it's right, honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians, kill and scalp all, big and little. So it was not just Indians who scalped, it was a method of keeping score. And it seems like Shivington's people had a propensity to mutilate bodies. And if you get a chance reading D. Brown's Bury My Heart, a Wounded Knee, of just the atrocities that Shivington had done with the natives was pretty incredible. Comes the Sand Creek Massacre. There was a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho that were gathered together and had actually a surrender flag and an American flag in their enclave. Most of the warriors were either out hunting or out fighting, but they were not in there. And they went in and just massacred all of the Indians that were in the tribe, the Sand Creek Massacre. And then actually took body parts, female native women body parts, and adorned their saddles and their horses, showing this great victory that they had in fact propagated. So 1877, another general talks about the presence of this large body of Indians bitterly hostile to us, go figure, in close proximity to the frontier, keeping in mind that the frontier continues to move westward as land is given away, and there's in fact people allowed to homestead on Indian land. So the massacre at Wounded Knee, 1890, with the Lakota people, this is a group where the cavalry came upon this tribe of Lakota in Wounded Knee, South Carolina, or South Dakota, I'm sorry. And they, in fact, again, and I'm sure by intent, there was very few warriors in the camp. There was women, children, elderly, and the infirmed. And there was a struggle with a native, a Lakota native named Black Coyote, who was deaf, and he remained in the village because of his infirmity at the time. And he came out with a rifle, and a cavalry soldier came to him to take the rifle away. There was a little struggle, not that the weapon was to be used, but the weapon, it was hard for the deaf Lakota to explain to him, this is my rifle, I own this, I've gotten it properly. And during that struggle, the rifle discharged. So with that one discharge of the rifle, the cavalry that was surrounding the encampment opened up with Hotchkiss guns. If you happen to know that, they're Gatling guns. They're repeating something in a 50 caliber range, and they killed all in the camp, including actually some of their own soldiers in the crossfire. And it's believed that all of that action was possibly in retaliation for Little Bighorn, which had occurred June 25th of 1876. And here's some photographs. This is a photograph of the mass burial at Wounded Knee, with the stacks of native bodies that they put in a mass grave. And their chief was actually in the camp because he was suffering from pneumonia. And this is Chief Spotted Elk, frozen in his last pose there. And the Army had photographers along the way just to help document what had actually happened. One of the things that bothered me the most, I'm a veteran, Army veteran, and to find out that 20 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor for the massacre. And I hope you fact check that, because it's right there in the record that they had in fact received the Medal of Honor. So the Indian Wars continued. You see we're up into the 1870s. And the economics of killing Indians was not very good in that it was expensive. In a book called Education for Extinction, they said it was as much as $1 million to kill an Indian. Now keep in mind that included the forts, the horses, the cavalry, all of that sort of thing. But it was very expensive. And the Indians were very good at what they did. This was their land and their territory, and they were very difficult to engage and very difficult to eliminate. So come the economic alternative was kind of just by chance that talking about educating in an Indian child for 8 years for about $1,200 in those days, in the economics of those days. And Richard Henry Pratt was in the cavalry, and he was in charge of Fort Marion in Florida. And if you don't know it, it's still there today, by the way. It's in St. Augustine, Florida. It's right on the water. It's right at the foot of the Bridge of Lions, in kind of an eerie place. But he had there a band of Geronimo's followers, renegades as they were called. And so he didn't know what to do with them. So he dressed them up in native uniforms, marched them around, got them to pretend like they were soldiers, and just was perplexed with how many of the Indians that the government was holding, those that did not acquiesce to the taking of the land. And he came up with the idea of the Indian Industrial School movement. And he was motivated by what he had seen at the Hampton Institute, which is now Hampton University, where they were educating freed slaves and doing very well at it and doing very well for the students there. So he wanted to take that model and set up an Indian school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The government came back and said, we will give you space at the encampment, the Army base at Carlisle. And that was actually the first of the Indian industrial schools. And the idea was to take young Native American children and educate the Indian out of them. Carlisle, interestingly enough, is still there. It's the Army War College, and it's a military base. You can get on the base, and most of the buildings are in fact still there. But his concept was kill the Indian and save the man. And he thought that that was in fact the best method that the government could take. And the Commission on Indian Affairs is to preserve them from extinction, not as an Indian, but as a human being. So obviously, there's something less than a human being, even to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as late as the 1870s. Here's a photograph. I own this photograph. I got this from the Cumberland County Historical Society. This is one class at Carlisle. And you need to understand that behind Carlisle, very quickly, the government opened up 25 more federally funded and organized Indian industrial schools. So the government had 26 of them, not counting the hundreds of missionary-based schools that the different religions were responsible for. This photograph, and I've looked at it through a magnifying glass, there's not a smile on any one of those kids' faces. Can you imagine getting 1,000 kids together? And the little guy right here in the front just breaks my heart. Interestingly, again, this is not a regional school. they very intentionally brought natives from all over the country. They wanted as few of the groups as they could. So it was likely that there were only 2 or 3 of these children could speak to one another when they were brought there. And they were brought there through coercion, through kidnap, through threats. And as many as 10,000 Indians went through Carlisle. This picture here, this house is still here. Pratt is up here on the balcony, and his horse is here on the right. And they were put in military uniforms. They were photographed, the before and after photographs. This is a Navajo named Tom Torlino, 1880 on the left and 1883 on the right. Cut his hair, took all of his cultural artifacts. What he would be wearing there, all of that would be like religious symbols to him. It was very significant to him, things that he made himself, things that were handed down to him, things were important in his way of life. All of that taken away. And they were able to show the government's investment by saying, look at the young man on the right. During the summer, they would be sent out to local farms to work for the farmer. They would spend all summer, the women would be doing domestic work, the men would be doing labor work, and the money was sent then back to the school, and the natives got none of it. But it was a fine Christian home, teaching them the Christian ways. And not only changing the outlook from these young people, but when they went back home almost as missionaries. And there's a book that a young lady named Stia makes a comment that she had been home for a visit during the summer for a week. They sent her on a train. And when she came back to Carlisle, she made the comment that her father was just such an Indian, that he hadn't converted, and that she was just so disgusted by his actions. And while at Carlisle, they had pageants where they'd make them dress up as pilgrims, if you can imagine how demeaning that is. And if that didn't work, they'd get them dressed up as conquistadors for the Spanish influence. So the Indian Industrial School movement went on to the early 1900s. And it's unfortunate, most of us think about Carlisle and we think about Jim Thorpe. And it's almost unfortunate that Jim Thorpe did so well at Carlisle. He became an Olympic medalist. He was a great football player. They actually played West Point when Dwight Eisenhower was at West Point playing on the other team and defeated West Point. And they were good athletes and basically channeled their aggressions in that manner. And so people think, oh, that's really great. Jim Thorpe did well. We're teaching Indians good, valuable skills. And they did teach them how to be masons and carpenters, blacksmith. None of that as a value to the Indian at the time, but it was mainly just a brainwashing to just deculturize them entirely. So when they went back, they would attempt to do the same thing with their families. As many as 1,000 died at Carlisle. There's a cemetery there. If you look at it, it looks a lot like Arlington National Cemetery, but they're finding upon exhuming some of the bodies to repatriate the remains that it's really just kind of a mass grave, and there's really little order to it. On the surface, it's headstone after headstone with names, but they really kind of tipped their hand when they had 2 headstones for the same person. As an indication that maybe it's not as organized as it once was. Some of the Indian schools evolved into legitimate schools, and some of them still exist to this very day. Carlisle was over in about the 1720s. So Indians didn't receive citizenship until 1924. And that's pretty amazing when you put it in the context of how recent that is. And I'm going to jump here to 1977. Forced sterilizations. Now, this is on your list for genocidal intent to deprive people of reproduction. This is the government's accounting office in 1976. Said that 3,400 forced sterilizations. So if a woman would come in for treatment under the Indian Health Services Act and have anything much more than a cold, she would typically go away with a forced tubal ligation or some type of sterilization. That's 1976. I'm going to read you. I don't have a slide for it, but here's a quote. We need to stop wasting all this time and energy apologizing to the American Indian, which we continue to do. We give them casinos, we give them special licenses, we give them special scholarships, and why I don't understand. We conquered them, that's history. Hello. You've got to be against giving welfare to American Indians because of the fact that 200 years ago, they were whipped in a war. Let's call it what it is. They lost a war. That's the mayor of Houston, Texas, March 27, 2007. So it continues on. When I give lectures at the college especially, I would ask students in the group, youngsters, some that are just basically right out of high school, and some a little older, to raise their hand if you can name the 3 ships that Columbus sailed on. And the majority of the students can name them. I'm sure all of you can name them to this very day. I learned it when I was in school, and they're still teaching it. And we have to come well past that. And here's another Saniana quote that I like a lot. History is what people tell you it is. And I think with Indigenous Peoples Day, with the movement that we're currently in, that we're moving past this. It is a pack of lies. The fact that Columbus was recognized in this country, and it's very difficult because there's a great sense of pride with the Italian American community with Christopher Columbus. The Catholic religion has the Knights of Columbus. But we have to understand what the real history is and what it is that we can do about it. So there's still some hope. We're still here. We still enjoy our culture. The 2010 census in the United States, 58,000 Native Americans declared in Maryland alone. And very interestingly, in 2000, there were 39,000 declared Native Americans. I don't think we gained 20,000 Indians in the 10 years, but people are starting to recognize it. I grew up when the last thing you wanted anybody to know is that you were an Indian, because you were subject to ridicule, mocking, people calling you chief and so forth, with little interest in what your culture really was. But so we kept it quiet. The hippies kind of saved us to some degree. During the hippie revolution, they embraced the culture. They embraced the clothing, the fringed jackets and so forth, the spirituality. But in doing so, they kind of homogenized it. So the tribal aspects of it kind of went away, and we became homogenized as Indians. And we don't mind being called Indian, by the way. It was a mistake that Columbus made. And in the Native community, we say to one another and on the side as they gave us the name Indian, and now they want to take that back. So it's Native American is fine, and Indigenous people really says it for us. So Canada recognizes its Native American population as First Nation. They were here first, and they recognize that, and they treat them a great deal differently. We have in the US 5.2 million. I'd like you folks, we have the 2020 census going on, and hopefully if it goes off well and is accurate, how many Native Americans will there be in Maryland in 2020? Now we've got DNA thrown in here as kind of an assistance with that. We have Native American politicians that we didn't even know about. So with that being said, I think things are going to move our way. Like I say, we've been going just happen chance, making little progress. And here in this last year, even amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, we're now following on the coattails of the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're getting recognition. 2 years ago, we met with the city council in Baltimore City and tried our darndest to get them to supplant Columbus Day with the Indigenous Peoples Day. And the final result was that with so much pushback from the Italian American community, they said, well, we won't do anything with Columbus Day, but we'll give you a separate day, which kind of missed the whole point. And here yet today, they celebrate it today. And Mayor Young has on his desk an article that will make Indigenous Peoples Day in Baltimore City a law. So we're hoping for the best there. So I say to you in my Salaji language, thank you, Wado. Thank you for your kind time and attention, especially in this time of not being able to be there face to face and do things in a normal fashion. So with that, I'll turn it back to the group.
Thank you very much. So we're going to open up just for a few minutes for any questions that people have for Dr. Seymour before we do our closing remarks. Feel free to either turn on your mic or post them in the chat.
Go ahead, anybody.
Hello. So I had a question about tribal culture. In our social studies class, we learned a lot about different tribes, and I was wondering how that plays out in the modern day.
Well, Garen can help me with this, I think, in an answer. We still are somewhat tribal, but as an example, the problem that so many of us have, including myself, is living in an urban setting. I don't know if any of you know Paul Chott Smith, who's a curator at the Bureau of American Indian Affairs, or I'm sorry, at the museum, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. In an essay he wrote, he said, if you're an urban Indian, you're screwed. So the fact is, it's difficult for those of us that live in the urban life. You know, I grew up, I was very lucky. I was very lucky to go to college. I had have had a good life. And so the tribal aspect of it, for those of us that are so far estranged from our tribal areas, or even those that are still living in tribal lands, like in Cherokee, North Carolina, we don't have that much influence tribally anymore. You know, we're all out here trying to make a living. We're trying to do the right thing, become educated and better people with less influence. And one of the things that we do at the Baltimore American Indian Center is we have culture classes. What would normally be achieved from the family is gotten from people teaching you, the elders teaching you, and so forth. So it's a little bit, the tribal influence is much less than it once was. In Maryland, we have 3 state recognized tribes, no federally recognized tribes, and no reservations. We have the Piscataway, Conoy, and on the eastern shore, Crisfield, we now have most recently the Acahanoks. So there's still some tribal influence there, but not what you would think it would be, especially for those of us that are urban Indians.
Okay, thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll add to that a little bit. You know, a lot of the issue is the history with erasing our culture, and like Dr. Seymour had said, the you know, how scary it was to even be a Native person. And so with that, you know, the way that our tribes have, or our culture has survived is passing it down. However, with that issue, people, you know, didn't even want to say they're Native lest they fear that they would be killed or have, you know, the government come after them. And so, you know, we have, I think it's around 78% of Natives who do not live on the reservation just because of how far removed that is from the society. But our culture is still preserved through our family and passing it down through generations, holding on to what we still have. You know, whether our language or religion was taken away, what we still have, we celebrate fully and happily every day.
Well put.
Is it possible I could ask a question, maybe? So I'm wondering, I know I have done some kind of research in aid paths in Indigenous communities. I know one thing I've heard a lot about is like cultural revitalization. And I know obviously over time, a lot of language, different culture has been lost. And I guess one thing I was wondering if you could kind of talk about, I know I've heard about it before, but kind of how does cultural revitalization, like in practice, kind of how does that take place? And like, once you've lost the language of a culture, like, is there any way you can still kind of learn more or still interact or engage with that culture?
It's a great question. You know, I essentially grew up Anglo. I was adopted, and I grew up Anglo. So most of the things that I do know are things that I had to search out, people I had to search out, groups and organizations that I had to search out, and so I think that's exactly what you're talking about. That's cultural revitalization. It's we're bringing it back. So the fact that we need to teach culture as opposed to have people learn culture within their families is a necessity. You know, this culture is on its way to extinction. I think that it's important. So with that saying that's a great question. I think it's difficult in urban settings, and most of the 58,000 natives in Maryland are in urban settings. So how do you really do that other than sharing it? Hopkins and other universities taking the bold move on Columbus Day to have, in fact, this kind of a presentation really does help revitalize that and keep it alive. Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, like, you know, one of the biggest things is support from non-Indigenous people, because people have a tendency to say, oh, it's just an Indigenous issue, like with missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's just an Indigenous issue, it doesn't affect us. But the fact of the matter is, we're only 2% of the US population. And so that support from our allies as well, giving us a voice, listening to our culture and helping us preserve it, helping us preserve our languages, our different programs is is one of the most crucial things.
Yeah, language is almost gone. So, behind language, the other parts of the culture will fall by the wayside as well. Drumming and dancing seems to be holding on pretty well, but a lot of the real artisans, pottery, blankets, and those sort of things, there are just very few people even practicing any of that today. So it's a difficult thing, and I think it's on its way to extinction. But everything we can do, like programs like this, will in fact help it along, help it keep it on life support, if you will.
We have a question from the chat. It says, to what extent did tribes and nations interact with one another before colonization? What did that look like?
That's kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The Cherokee and the Creeks were at war continually with hatred. More modernly, if you can imagine, there's some animosity between the Lumbees in southeastern North Carolina and the Cherokee in southwestern North Carolina. And we kind of are our own worst enemies. We get into discussions of blood quantum, and I could talk for hours on blood quantum. And I've had people ask me, how much Indian are you? You would never ask an African American that question in today's society, but it seems okay to ask that of an Indian. And the fact that we continue to squabble, and so not only are there some tribal issues that go back hundreds of years, but there's also the blood quantum issues. And so sometimes we're our own worst enemies. I think the greater assimilation and the less war was probably in the Woodlands Indians, the Iroquois society, the Iroquois people. But in the Southeast, there was, the Cherokee joined with the government to fight the Creek Indians. That doesn't make for good neighbors. So there's still a lot of problem there. But that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, you won't find a society that didn't war with each other or have any war whatsoever unless they were completely isolated. And, even then they probably fought against themselves. But we didn't commit genocide against each other. And what Dr. Seymour is talking about with blood quantum and asking a native how much they are, like, we actually have to have official cards by the US government to say that we are Native American, which you don't see with other races. You don't have to prove, how much you are or what you are. You'd never say that to someone who isn't Indigenous.
Chief John Ross, that I mentioned earlier, was actually 1/8 Cherokee, and the natives and the people that followed him didn't care. He had 1/8 Cherokee through his matriarchal lineage, and that qualified him. The blood quantum is really a government invention, that if they gave you something, either land or put you to a reservation or anything, the government kept tally, and they wanted to know, do you qualify? So the whole blood quantum thing started back in the 1700s with the government figuring out who was an Indian and who wasn't. The Indians didn't care. And kind of, in fact, has resurrected itself with the casino money. Who's entitled to the casino money? Of course, they're all about to put each other out of business. They're not doing nearly as well as they once did, even before the pandemic. But, who's entitled? And we've seen cases about where family living on the reservation got casino money, and brothers and sisters that had moved to the city were not able to get the money. So the whole blood quantum thing keeps coming back, but the blood quantum thing is a government invention, to tell you the truth.
All right, I know we have a couple more questions. However, we are cutting it short on time. So what I propose to you is that we're going to do closing remarks, but if you still have questions, I'll stay on at least and answer some of those. But otherwise, Dr. Seymour, it is always a pleasure to hear you speak. We, like to thank you very much for not only being our lecturer on Indigenous Peoples Day, but also everything you've done for the Indigenous community. We'd like to thank again OMA for co-hosting this event, and for everyone for coming here tonight. If you're interested in the Indigenous students at Hopkins, our next general body meeting is October 20th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard. Everyone is welcome. Whether or not you identify as Indigenous, we'd love to have you, love to celebrate our culture together. And then we have an event coming up with Olay about homogenization and stereotypes. It'll be November 5th at 6:30. Yes, November 5th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we hope to see you all there.
Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Can we get a round of applause, virtual applause to Dr. Seymour and the ISH leadership, Garion, Connor, and Jasmine, and the membership of ISH. You all did a phenomenal job. Please be on the lookout for future programs. We will have the Indigenous Heritage 365 speaker series, November 12th, 7 p.m. And we're going to have a storyteller and flute musician. So you do not want to miss this event. So we look forward to continuing honoring and diving deep into the Indigenous people as well as their Native American history and culture. So again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.